What if the reason you're still broke isn't in your bank account but in your childhood? Most people believe money is a matter of logic, of effort, opportunity, or intelligence. But deep within the mind, far beneath the numbers, lies a story that logic can't touch. Carl Jung called it the complex, an invisible knot of emotion, memory, and fear that secretly shapes the destiny of every adult. When it comes to money, most of us are not poor. We are programmed. Jung once wrote that the child is the father of the man. He meant that who we become as adults is not written by reason, but by the emotional experiences that shaped us when we were defenseless. And in those early years, the mind doesn't just learn, it absorbs. It takes the moods, the silences, the struggles of our parent and translates them into laws. If your father ever said money doesn't grow on trees, if your mother ever cried over unpaid bills, if you ever felt the tension of scarcity in your home, your nervous system learned something powerful, that safety and abundance cannot coexist. That lesson, encoded in emotion, became your first financial archetype. Not an idea, a feeling. A feeling that still decides whether you feel worthy of having or safer in losing. To Jung, this was not about economics. It was about the psyche's relationship with survival and power. He believed every human carries a symbolic connection with energy, and money in our modern world became the new symbol of that energy. So when we fear money, avoid it, or lose it, it's not money we're afraid of. It's power. It's responsibility. It's freedom. In the quiet corners of our childhood homes, something sacred and dangerous happens. The child begins to build an inner map of worth. It watches how adults behave when resources appear or disappear. And whatever emotion dominates the room, fear, guilt, conflict, shame, becomes the emotional tone attached to wealth itself. That tone becomes what Jung called a complex of inferiority, a psychic structure that whispers, "You don't deserve more than this." It doesn't care what you think, it cares what you feel. And this is where the true poverty begins. Not in the wallet, but in the unconscious. A child who grew up watching struggle learns to associate effort with survival. A child who saw wealth bring conflict learns to avoid abundance. A child who heard silence around money learns that it is taboo, something dangerous, something not to be discussed. That silence becomes a spell. It shapes every future conversation, every opportunity, every relationship with value. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what happens. The adult repeats the emotion of the child, different stage, same story. You can change jobs, partners, countries. The complex follows you. It hides in how you price your work, how you react to abundance, how you sabotage when success arrives. It's not failure. It's loyalty. Loyalty to the emotional truth of your childhood. If your parents were afraid of wealth, you inherited the fear. If they felt guilty for having more, you inherited the guilt. If they equated poverty with purity, you may subconsciously romanticize struggle. This is what Jung called the ancestral shadow, the parts of the psyche that are not individually yours, but live through you as patterns of those who came before. Money for many families is not just currency, it's karma. And so generation after generation, the same unconscious story unfolds. The father who works endlessly yet never gets ahead. The mother who saves every penny yet feels unsafe. The child who grows up and repeats both stories at once. To Jung, these patterns were not coincidences. They were manifestations of what he called the collective unconscious, the invisible field of psychic inheritance that binds us all. He believed that each person's financial reality is a mirror of their psychic development. To heal your relationship with money is to heal your relationship with power itself. In the modern world, we talk about money mindset. But Jung would have called it a psychic imbalance, a disconnection between the conscious and unconscious attitudes toward survival. He wrote that any repression in the psyche creates a compensatory reaction in the outer world. So when we repress our fear of scarcity, it returns as chaos in our finances. When we deny our desire for wealth, it returns as envy toward those who have it. And when we ignore our guilt around success, it returns as self-sabotage right before we rise. That's not coincidence, that's psychic economy. To truly understand why you stay broke, you must look beyond budgets and jobs. You must look into the emotional logic of your inner child, the part of you that still believes safety means having little, or that love only comes when you sacrifice yourself. That child never grew up financially. Fiat still handles your money today. Every time you say, I can't charge that much, or I don't deserve this, or I'll give more and ask for less, it's that child speaking, the one who was told to be humble, quiet, and grateful for crumbs. Jung would say that child has become a complex with its own will. It's not evil, it's protective. It learned that staying small meant staying safe. But that same safety is now your prison. Let's imagine this scene. A 5-year-old watches their parents argue about bills. Voices rise, fear fills the room, love disappears. In that moment, the child's nervous system fuses money with danger, and the psyche decides, if I have money, I lose love. 25 years later, that same child, now an adult, earns well, then suddenly spends everything, or quits just before a promotion, or chooses a partner who drains them financially. They're not careless. They're consistent with their unconscious equation: money, loss of love. This is how trauma becomes identity. The emotion of one night becomes the fate of a lifetime. To Jung, trauma was not just a wound, it was a split in the soul. A part of you stays frozen at the age it got hurt. That part still governs your instincts around survival and worth. When you avoid checking your bank account, that part is trembling. When you underprice your work, that part is apologizing for existing. When you feel guilt for success, that part is trying not to repeat the pain of others. This is the tragedy of inherited scarcity. We carry emotions that were never ours, yet we pay for them every day. Healing begins not with affirmations, but with awareness. You must see the child in you who is still afraid of abundance. Not to fix them, but to listen. To Jung, listening to the unconscious was the highest form of respect. He called it active imagination, entering into dialogue with the inner figures that live within your mind. If you sat quietly today and asked your inner child, "What do you believe about money?" the answer might surprise you. You might hear, "Money breaks families," or "People will hate me if I succeed," or "If I have more, someone else will have less." Those sentences are not logical. They are emotional contracts, contracts written before you could think, but still signed by your actions today. Until you tear those contracts, no amount of strategy can save you. Because your life isn't following logic, it's obeying memory. And so the path out of scarcity begins not with income, but with insight. The moment you see that your financial struggle is not moral, not intellectual, but emotional, that's when you regain power. Jung said, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." When you unite the two, you stop repeating history. The child no longer drives the car, you do. But first you must turn toward the past. not to blame, but to understand. The poverty you grew up in might not have been just economic. It may have been emotional poverty, the absence of safety, of affirmation, of possibility, and that kind of poverty follows you longer than any debt. You may think you're making choices about money, but what if money has been choosing for you? What if every decision you've ever made about wealth, work, or self-worth was filtered through an invisible force inside your psyche, a pattern older than logic, older than language itself? Carl Jung called that force a complex. He described it as a cluster of psychic energy with its own will and intelligence. In simple words, it's a living piece of your unconscious mind that acts like a hidden personality. And one of the most powerful of these hidden personalities is what we now call the poverty complex. The poverty complex is not about how much money you have. It's about what your nervous system believes you deserve to keep. It operates like a thermostat. No matter how high your income rises, the inner temperature of scarcity pulls it back to normal. You get a raise, and suddenly a new expense appears. You pay off debt, and another crisis begins. You earn more, and yet you feel the same anxiety. To Jung, this was not coincidence, it was psychic compensation. The unconscious seeks balance. If the conscious ego strives for too much control or too much expansion, the unconscious compensates by creating limitation, a kind of spiritual gravity. So if your conscious mind says, "I want to be wealthy," but your unconscious believes wealth is dangerous, the complex will create events to protect you from your own success. You might call it bad luck. Jung would call it fate born from the unconscious. Jung observed that a complex forms when emotion and idea fuse together under trauma. In financial trauma, this often happens when love and fear collide. Imagine a child watching their parents argue over money. The room fills with tension. Love disappears. The child's psyche links money, loss of love. Years later, that link still exists, invisible but absolute. So when that adult begins to earn or receive, their body feels danger. They unconsciously sabotage the flow. Not because they're foolish, but because their nervous system is loyal to safety over success. That loyalty is the foundation of the poverty complex. It values emotional security over external abundance. And as long as the two are in conflict, safety always wins. One of Jung's most fascinating insights was that the unconscious behaves like an ancient religion. It creates moral codes, invisible commandments that you obey without knowing why. For those with a poverty complex, the commandments sound like this: wanting more makes you greedy. If you have, someone else will have less. You must suffer to be worthy. Money changes people for the worse. These are not beliefs. They are taboos, psychic laws carved in emotion. Breaking them feels like betraying your family, your roots, even your soul. That's why the moment abundance approaches, guilt appears. The unconscious punishes the ego for violating its ancient rule. And guilt is the chain that keeps the complex alive. Jung wrote that a complex draws power from repression. Whatever you refuse to feel, the complex will feel for you, louder. When you suppress ambition, it turns into envy. When you suppress anger, it turns into victimhood. When you suppress desire, it turns into resentment. These emotions then attract situations that justify them, keeping the loop alive. You see someone succeed, and you feel tension. You justify it, they probably cheated. But beneath that judgment lies pain, the pain of a part of you that was never allowed to want. The poverty complex feeds on that pain. It whispers, stay small, stay good, stay safe. And so you obey, believing it's humility. But humility born from fear is not virtue, it's self-erasure. Inside every person with a poverty complex lives an invisible courtroom. On one side sits the ego, dreaming of abundance. On the other sits the internalized parent, the judge, the moral authority, the voice that says, "Who do you think you are to want this much?" Jung called this internal figure the parent archetype. It represents the collective authority of society, religion, and family, all merged into one psychic image. To grow beyond it, you must face that inner judge without hatred, because it's not your enemy, it's your guardian. It once protected you from rejection. It kept you safe in smallness. But now it must evolve. Jung would call this integration of the complex, not destroying it, but transforming its energy into consciousness. The poverty complex wears many masks. Here are a few Jung might recognize. The saver, hoards money but never feels secure. The unconscious message, "I must control or I'll lose everything." The giver, overgives, undercharges, and confuses generosity with self-sacrifice. Message, "If I take, I'll lose love." The avoider, ignores bills, hides from reality. Message, "If I don't look, it's not real." The achiever, works endlessly, yet always feels empty. Message, "If I stop striving, I'll disappear." Different behaviors, same root, fear disguised as virtue. In Jungian theory, no complex belongs purely to the individual. Each is also a symptom of the collective psyche, the consciousness of humanity itself. In the modern world, the collective poverty complex manifests as mass anxiety, debt culture, and spiritual emptiness. We glorify productivity and call it virtue. We exhaust ourselves to prove our worth. And deep down, we still believe suffering earns salvation. This is why no financial education can cure the deeper hunger, because the wound isn't in the economy, it's in the soul. Jung foresaw this. He warned that as society lost its connection to inner meaning, people would seek false gods, systems, markets, ideologies, to replace spirit. He wrote, "Where love stops, power begins, and violence and terror." The modern war over wealth is not about numbers. It's about a lost relationship with meaning. Money became the new symbol of God, and poverty, the new symbol of purity. To heal one's finances, therefore, is a spiritual act, not a material one. At some point, every person meets what Jung called the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds what the ego rejects. For the financially wounded, the shadow often contains repressed greed, desire, pride, and self-worth. We are taught to reject these qualities, but by rejecting them, we give them power. The more you deny your desire, the more you are controlled by hidden envy. The more you repress pride, the more you crave recognition. To integrate the poverty complex, you must reclaim the very traits you were told were bad. You must allow yourself to want, to receive, to hold, without shame. Jung said, "I'd rather be whole than good." Wholeness includes the parts that society condemns, and until you reclaim them, you'll keep playing small to stay good. The first crack in the complex appears the moment you recognize it exists. Awareness dissolves the spell. You begin to see patterns not as fate, but as feedback. When you overspend, you ask, "What emotion am I escaping?" When you undercharge, you ask, "Who taught me to fear being valued?" When you feel envy, you ask, "What desire in me is asking to be acknowledged?" These questions open a dialogue between the conscious ego and the unconscious complex. And dialogue is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming a whole person. Every time you face a fear about money and stay present instead of fleeing, you reclaim energy from the complex. You turn fear into power. That's not affirmation. That's alchemy, turning psychic lead into gold. In a letter to a student, Jung wrote, "The gold you seek lies not in the outer world, but in the dark places of your own soul." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He meant that every material pursuit hides a psychological need: recognition, freedom, safety, love. When those needs are met within, money loses its power to define you. Then, paradoxically, it begins to flow. Because you no longer chase it from fear, the psyche rewards wholeness. When you act from integrity, not guilt, not compensation, the outer world mirrors that balance. This is what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that arise when inner and outer worlds align. To heal from the poverty complex is an act of rebellion, not against society, but against inherited limitation. It's refusing to worship smallness. It's declaring that abundance is not greed, and self-worth is not arrogance. It's remembering that money, like fire, is neither holy nor evil. It only magnifies the state of the soul that wields it. Jung would tell you that becoming conscious of your financial psyche is part of becoming fully human. Because how you relate to energy, whether in love, creativity, or money, reveals how you relate to life itself. There comes a moment in every journey when knowledge is no longer enough. You've seen the patterns, you've named the wounds, you've understood the complex, and yet nothing changes. Jung warned that awareness without transformation becomes another defense. You can study your trauma endlessly and still remain its prisoner, because the mind loves understanding, but the soul demands experience. The question is no longer, why am I broke? The question is, who is the one inside me that needs to stay broke to feel safe? That's the real confrontation, not with the world, but with the self. The descent before the rise. In Jungian psychology, every transformation begins with descent. Before light, there is darkness. Before freedom, confrontation. He called this the night sea journey, the moment when the conscious ego descends into the depths of the unconscious to meet the forces it has denied. To heal the poverty complex, you must descend into the very emotions you've avoided. Fear, envy, shame, guilt, they are not your enemies, they are guides. Each feeling is an unopened letter from the past. Inside it says, "Here lies the part of you that never felt worthy." When you stop running and finally feel what you once feared, the complex begins to dissolve. Because the complex feeds on avoidance, and awareness starves it. But this is not a comfortable process. Jung compared it to alchemy, the heating of raw matter until the old form dies. He wrote, "The gold is born in the fire of suffering. That suffering is not punishment, it's purification." Meeting the inner child again. To heal the wound that keeps you poor, you must meet the one who was poor, the child who learned that safety meant smallness. Close your eyes and imagine them sitting across from you. They don't trust abundance yet. They've seen love disappear when money entered the room. They've seen fear in the eyes of the adults they adored, so they made a vow, "I'll never cause that pain." That vow has been running your life. Jung would tell you, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. Those unlived dreams, the opportunities your parents couldn't take, the confidence they couldn't embody, live in you as guilt. You carry their limitation as loyalty, but loyalty to pain is not love. True love honors what they couldn't finish, by finishing it. When you earn, when you create, when you expand, you're not betraying them, you're redeeming them. The child inside you is waiting for permission to grow up financially. You are the only one who can give it. Integration, the real freedom. Once you've met the child, The next task is to integrate the adult. Integration is not thinking differently, it's being differently. You no longer react to scarcity as danger. You recognize it as memory. The nervous system learns a new language, safety in abundance. Jung wrote that every complex, once made conscious, becomes a source of power. The energy that once sabotated you now fuels creativity, purpose, and expansion. This is how psychological alchemy works. The same fire that burned you becomes the flame that illuminates your path. You start seeing money not as a mirror of worth, but as an expression of energy. You give because you have. You receive because you can hold. You no longer chase and you circulate. That is wealth in its truest form, balanced flow, the individuation of wealth. Jung's final stage of growth was called individuation, the process of becoming whole, of uniting the conscious ego with the unconscious self. In that union, you stop being a victim of inherited programs and start living as the author of your story. Money then becomes a mirror of consciousness. When you act from fear, it disappears. When you act from truth, it aligns. The self, Jung's symbol of divine wholeness, doesn't care about status or luxury. It seeks harmony. When your relationship with wealth becomes harmonious, the world reflects it. This doesn't mean everyone becomes rich. It means the war with survival ends, and peace with life begins. You trust the flow of giving and receiving because you trust yourself. And that trust, not the amount in your account, is what makes you free. The collective healing. What happens when one person heals their financial wound? The whole field changes. Jung believed the individual psyche and the collective psyche are one ocean. Each act of consciousness sends ripples through the whole. So when you break your family's pattern of scarcity, when you stop equating humility with self-denial, when you allow yourself to thrive without guilt, you are healing more than yourself. You are healing your lineage. You become what Jung called a redeemer archetype, the one who brings light into the ancestral shadow, not by preaching, but by living consciously. Your success becomes sacred because it's no longer about ego, it's about evolution. The new myth of wealth. Jung often said that modern humans no longer live their own lives, they live their myths unconsciously. Our current myth is scarcity. It says, there isn't enough, someone must lose for me to win. But myths can evolve. And when consciousness evolves, the story changes. The new myth of wealth begins with a single realization: money is not the goal, meaning is. When meaning returns, greed fades. When value is sacred again, waste ends. When you honor your gifts, the world honors them too. This is what Jung meant when he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. To become who you truly are, not the frightened child, not the guilty adult, but the integrated being who knows that inner and outer worlds mirror each other. That is the real gold. The final liberation. Imagine waking up one morning and feeling enough. Not because your circumstances changed overnight, but because you finally stopped believing you were unworthy of change. The poverty complex dissolves not when you earn more, but when you stop identifying with the story of lack. When you say, that was never my voice. When you realize that poverty was an identity borrowed from fear, not your essence. In that moment, abundance ceases to be a chase and becomes a state of being. You act from love, not survival. You give without losing and receive without guilt. This is the ultimate Jungian liberation, the union of spirit and matter, psyche and world, meaning and money. Not the end of desire, the sanctification of it. Jung wrote, "The treasure you seek lies in the cave you fear to enter." And that cave was never outside you. It was in the memory, the shame, the guilt you avoided. You entered it and found yourself. The closing reflection. So, why do you stay broke? Because a part of you still believes love and abundance cannot coexist. Because you mistook humility for smallness. Because you inherited a story that said sacrifice is safer than success. But now you see the truth. You've heard the voice beneath the voice, the one that no longer needs to be poor to feel pure. And that awareness changes everything. You are no longer the child who repeats the past. You are the adult who redeems it. You are the alchemist of your own psyche. You are the one Jung foresaw, the human brave enough to make the unconscious conscious. The moment you live from that awareness, your relationship with money and with life transforms from fear to freedom. Because what you once called broke was never about wealth, it was about worth. The treasure was never out there. It was the moment you realized you were enough to hold it.